Hello, this is Brian, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 11th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is the front page article. Trump allies near, quote, total victory in wiping out U.S. climate regulation. A small group of conservative activists has worked for 16 years to stop all government efforts to fight climate change. Their efforts seem poised to pay off. In the summer of 2022, Democrats in Congress were racing to pass the biggest climate law in the country's history, and President Joe Biden Jr. was declaring that global warming posed a clear and present danger to the United States. But behind the scenes, 4 Trump administration veterans were plotting to obliterate federal climate efforts once Republicans regained control in office in Washington, according to documents reviewed by the New York Times and interviewers with more than a dozen people familiar with the matter. 2 of them, Russell T. Vought and Jeffrey B. Clark, were high-profile allies of Donald Trump. Mr. Vought, who has railed against climate alarmism, and Mr. Clark, who has called climate rules a, quote, Leninistic plot to seize control of the economy, drafted executive orders for the next Republican president to dismantle climate initiatives. The other 2, Mandy Gunaseka and Jonathan Brightbill, were lesser-known conservative attorneys with long histories of fighting climate initiatives. Ms. Gunaseka, a one-time aide to the most vocal global warming denialists in the state, and Mr. Brightbill, who had argued in court against Obama-era climate regulations, collected an arsenal of information to chip away at the scientific consensus that the planet is warming, documents show. The overwhelming majority of scientists agree around the world that carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases are dangerously heating the planet and supercharging storms, droughts, heat waves, and sea level rise, directly contradicting the 4 conservatives. Nevertheless, their efforts are now paying off. In the coming days, the Environmental Protection Agency is expected to revoke a determination that has underpinned the federal government's ability to fight global warming since 2009. That scientific conclusion, known as the endangerment finding, determined that greenhouse gases threaten public health and welfare. It required the federal government to regulate these gases, which result from the burning of oil, gas, and coal. In revoking that determination, the Trump administration would erase limits on greenhouse gases from cars, power plants, and industries that generate the planet-warming pollution. Unlike the swings in federal policy that have been routine when administrations change hands, getting rid of the endangerment finding could hamstring any future administration's effort to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We are pretty close to total victory, said Myron Ebell, who helped the first Trump administration set up operations at the EPA, and has been attacking climate science and policies for nearly 3 decades. Mr. Ebell said that dozens of conservative activists, lawyers, scientists, and others who had worked for years to prepare the case against endangerment finding. But he singled out Mr. Vought, Mr. Clark, Mr. Brightbill, and Ms. Gunaseka as the ones who drafted detailed plans of attack that the second Trump administration has largely followed. Quote, no amount of upside public support would have done anything if there hadn't been those 4 people, Russ and Jeff and John and Mandy, he said. Funding an arsenal. When the EPA issued the endangerment finding under President Barack Obama, it offered a mountain of peer-reviewed scientific evidence. In more than 200 pages, the agency detailed how increasingly severe heat waves, storms, and droughts were expected to contribute to disease and death. Conservative groups and businesses initially fought to discredit the science, but as they lost challenges and public concern about global warming began to grow, many corporations withdrew from the battle. By 2017, when Mr. Trump first took office, hundreds of U.S. companies, including U.S. oil giants and major manufacturers had accepted the reality of climate change. Even Mr. Trump's top advisors at the time rejected the most extreme demands of those who wanted to challenge the science. Days before Mr. Trump left office in January 2021, his EPA denied a petition from Mr. Abel's group to reconsider the endangerment finding. There wasn't just an appetite among any of the institutional crowd, said Michael McKenna, who worked in the White House on energy issues during Trump's first term. Still, some conservative activists who insisted that the threat of climate change was overblown kept up the fight during the Biden years. One of them was Ms. Gunnescara, who served as EPA Chief of Staff during Mr. Trump's first term and wrote the EPA chapter of Project 2025, the set of conservative policy recommendations for a second Trump term. Another was Mr. Brightbill, a partner at the law firm Winston & Strawn, who had served in the Justice Department's Administrative and Environmental Division during the first Trump administration. Ms. Gunnescara is known in Washington for handling a snowball to James M. Info, then a Republican senator from Oklahoma, and her boss on a cold February day in 2015. Mr. Inhofe held up that the snowball at the end of the Senate as evidence that the planet could not be warmed dangerously. Mr. Brightbill, for his part, has gained some attention for prosecuting the owners of the Oklahoma Zoo featured in the Netflix documentary series Tiger King. But his main focus as a federal attorney has been defending the first Trump administration's repeal of Obama-era climate rules, including a landmark regulation aimed at curbing greenhouse gases from power plant smokestacks. In the summer of 2022, as Mr. Biden and Democratic lawmakers were ramping up their climate efforts, Ms. Gunnescara and Mr. Brightbill sought $2 million for a secretive campaign to kill the endangerment funding, according to a funding pitch obtained by Field Notes, a watchdog group that investigates the oil and gas industry. The two wanted funding to draft regulatory documents that a future administration could use to abandon the endangerment finding. They also plan to solicit white papers from favored scientists who did not accept the physics of climate change. The endangerment finding has helped Democrats wage a, quote, war on fossil fuels, Ms. Gunnescara and Mr. Brightbill wrote in a funding pitch. Conservatives need a comprehensive strategy for reversing the funding on day one of the next Republican administration, they wrote. The campaign would operate in secret to prevent media and other conflicted sources from shamed participants and undercutting the work before it's done. The Heritage Foundation eventually agreed to fund some of its work, although it is unclear whether the group provided the full $2 million, according to the two people familiar with the matter. A spokesperson from the Heritage Foundation, where Ms. Gunnescara was a visiting fellow from September 22 to December 24, did not respond to questions. Ms. Gunnescara said in a text message that she was extremely proud of the work I and others produced at the Heritage Foundation to rebuke junk science and expose the Green New scam. She said her work for the group had helped inform Cooling the Climate Hysteria, a collection of essays by scholars who reject mainstream climate science. It features a melting ice cube on its cover. Ben Dietrich, a spokesman for the Energy Department, where Mr. Brightbill is now in the General Counsel, declined to make him available for an interview, but said in an email, quote, Jonathan Brightbill brings a deep understanding of energy and environmental issues that make him exceptionally qualified for this role. Clinching total victory. While many conservatives lined up against the endangerment finding when it was established, Mr. Clark started to find its core principles many years earlier. In 2005, as a 38-year-old Justice Department lawyer in the George W. Bush administration, Mr. Clark argued in federal court that the Clean Air Act did not give the EPA the power to regulate greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court rejected that argument in a landmark 2007 case called Massachusetts versus EPA, clearing the way for the agency to issue the endangerment finding 2 years later. It was a stinging defeat that Mr. Clark was determined to reverse, according to people familiar with the matter and his own remarks on podcasts, panels, and other public forums. His next opportunity came in 2022 when he joined a conservative research organization called the Center for Renewing America. Mr. Vaught was running the center from an old row house near the Capitol, where he complained a pigeon infesting the walls. From there, Mr. Vaught drew up sweeping plans for a second-term Trump administration. Under Mr. Vaught's supervision, Mrs. Clark drafted executive orders that a future president could use to swiftly scrap Mr. Biden's climate policies, according to two people familiar with the matter. He also brainstormed legal arguments that the future administration could use to repeal the endangerment finding, the people said. Former colleagues of Mr. Clark said that he was less convinced with reducing the costs of companies of complying with environmental laws than with fighting what he saw as government overreach in the form of climate policies. Mr. Clark has called climate initiatives part of the, quote, plot to control Americans and to undermine the U.S. economy. He has called environmentalists a crazy climate cult and compared them to the authoritarian pig characters in George Orwell's dystopian novel Animal Farm. Mr. Clark is an ideologue with very, very strong views that EPA shouldn't regulate greenhouse gases, says Richard Lazarus, a professor of environmental law at Harvard Law School and author of the book The Rule of Five, Making Climate History at the Supreme Court, in which Mr. Clark figures prominently. For the Russell Vaught's, the Jeff Clarks, there has been a bee in their bonnet, Mr. Lazarus said. At the time that he was hired, Mr. Clark was facing a criminal investigation in connection with Mr. Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia. President Trump preemptively pardoned Mr. Clark in November, and the Georgia case was dismissed. With Mr. Trump's return to the White House last year, Mr. Clark became the government's top regulatory official as the acting head of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Mr. Vaught is once again the White House budget director and Mr. Clark's boss. In their new roles, both men have focused on ridding the government of green initiatives. And Mr. Clark has pushed EPA lawyers to strengthen their legal arguments for repealing the endangerment finding, according to two people familiar with the matter. Allie McCandless, a spokeswoman for the White House Office of Management and Budget, declined to make Mr. Clark available for an interview or respond to questions about his work. She said in a statement that Trump administration officials were, quote, working in lockstep to execute on the president's deregulation agenda. Neil Chatterjee, a Republican who led the Federal Agency Regulation Commission in the first Trump administration, said conservative activists had helped sustain the fight against the endangerment finding even after businesses backed out. It's not the corporate interest, he said. It's a pure ideological activists who believe that climate change is a hoax, who believe that this was about transferring wealth and driving socialism and destroying renewable energy and promoting left-wing ideology. This is their moment, he said. Stephen J. Malloy, a former Trump administration advisor who runs a website that promotes theories that climate change is not real, that the work of conservative activists might have gone nowhere if a different Republican had won the presidency. Instead, the activists found a receptive host in Mr. Trump, who has called climate change a hoax and a con job. The next challenge is to ensure the repeal of the endangerment finding holds up in court, he says. We've kept the skepticism alive, Mr. Malloy said, adding, I hope we don't blow it. I don't know when or if this opportunity will ever come around again. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump is a global wrecking ball, European security experts say. The organizers of the Munich Security Conference, Europe's main defense-related forum, said in a report that President Trump is helping to destroy the post-war international order. By Jim Tankersley, reporting from Berlin. The security order that has bound together the West and much of the rest of the world since the end of World War II is under attack from President Trump and like-minded leaders, officials of the Munich Security Conference warned on Monday in remarkably blunt terms. The world has entered an era of, quote, wrecking ball politics, a team of conference staff wrote on Monday in their 2026 Munich Security Report. The conference is a highly watched annual gathering of security officials from Europe, the U.S., and beyond, and was rolled out last year by a castigating speech from President and Vice President J.D. Vance, who called on European leaders to cooperate with parties they have deemed extreme. This year's conference, which opens on Friday, has taken on a more urgent tone amid growing concerns in Europe over Russian military aggression and Mr. Trump's rapidly refashioned security strategy, including his ongoing efforts to pry Greenland from Denmark. The report summarizes those concerns, which have been repeatedly voiced by European officials in recent months, in terms that are more strident and detailed than many European leaders have typically dared to express. Ironically, the President of the United States, the country that did more than any other to shape the post-1945 international order, is now the most prominent of the demolition men, the authors wrote. Quote, as a result, more than 80 years after construction began, the post-war international order is now under destruction. Under Donald Trump, they say, the United States has largely abandoned the role of the leader of the free world. The U.S. ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, rejected those characterizations on Monday. Quote, I don't see a world under destruction, Mr. Whitaker said at an event helped to mark the security report's release, adding that the Trump administration is not trying to dismantle NATO. He suggested Mr. Trump's actions were simply meant to force Europe to be stronger. When your kids are young, they're dependent on you, he said, but eventually you expect them to get a job, and so that's, to me, where we are. The report includes survey data showing growing and widespread disenchantment among residents of wealthy countries who have lost their faith in the ability of traditional democratic institutions to solve problems and improve life for future generations. It calls Mr. Trump and similar leaders, like President Javier Milei of Argentina, the beneficiaries of these trends. And it details several ways in which Mr. Trump has broken from long-standing practices of the post-war era, including imposition of tariffs on longtime allies, volatile support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia, and sharp cuts in aids to impoverished countries. Perhaps most shockingly, the authors wrote, the U.S. under Trump has now disregarded some of the most basic norms of the post-1945 system. Territorial integrity and the prohibition of threat or use of force against other states. In keeping with the prevailing mood against European leaders, the report said that Mr. Trump and others' new demolition policies may create a less safe and prosperous world, one shaped by transactional details rather than principled cooperation, private rather than public interests, and regions shaped by regional hegemons rather than universal norms. Mr. Trump is not scheduled to appear at the appearance. Neither is Mr. Vance. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to address this year's gathering on Saturday. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Olympic men's hockey cheat sheet. Canada vs. USA schedules watch guide. Austin Matthews and the United States play their first game on Thursday. After 12 years, an appetizer last February in the form of the Four Nations face-off and the 4 months worth of regular season prologue, NHL players are ready to return to the ice at the Olympics. The best hockey players on earth didn't participate at Pyeongchang in 2018 or Beijing in 2022 due to disputes between international governing bodies and the COVID-19 pandemic. It was difficult, Canada captain Sidney Crosby, one of the few holdovers from Sochi in 2014, told reporters in Milan. You try not to get your hopes up too much, but you also have to be ready in the case we go. It was a bit of a roller coaster. I'm really happy we have the experience to come back here. It was an amazing experience. With the tournament beginning on Wednesday, here's everything you need to know about Olympic men's hockey. Tournament format. The basic format is unchanged from 2014. If you've forgotten how things worked over the last 12 years, though, you're forgiven. There's a 12-team field. The top 8 participating nations in the IIHF rankings, host country Italy, as well as 3 others that qualified through performance at other tournaments. Those 12 teams are divided up into 3 groups. Canada is the highest ranked team in Group A, Finland the highest in Group B, and the United States in the highest in Group C. Each team will play every other team within its own group once from February 11th to 15th. Teams will receive 3 points for a regulation win, 2 for an overtime or shootout win, and 1 for an overtime or shootout defeat. 4 teams, the top from each group, along with the second place team with the most points, will automatically advance to the quarterfinals, or quote, round of 8. The remaining 8 teams will advance to the so-called playoff round, where the 4 winners will advance to the quarterfinals and face the waiting top 4 qualifiers. The 4 teams that lose in the quarterfinals, will be finished. The 2 teams that lose in the semifinals will play for the bronze medal. The 2 teams that win the semifinals will play for the gold. Canada versus USA. There's a world in which the United States entered the tournament as the favorite to win the gold over Canada. That's how much the gap between the 2 countries has closed in the last 12 years. An optimized American lineup could turn games between the countries into a coin flip. The question, of course, is whether that's the type of lineup the U.S. has brought to Milan. 3 of the top 4 American goal scorers in the NHL this season are staying home. Whether those 3 were in the mix or not, the top of the U.S. lineup doesn't compete with Canada's. Connor McDavid, Nathan MacKinnon are 2 of the best forwards in the tournament. Austin Matthews and Jack Eichel are good enough to keep that manageable enough, but they can't close it entirely. That's Canada's greatest edge. Really, for all the carping about the absence of Robertson and Caulfield in the United States, deserved as it may be, the rest of the U.S. forward lineup is deep and talented enough to hang together. While Matthew and Brady Tkachuk playing between Eichel is interesting, the Americans can't quite offer anything like the third-line center Sidney Crosby, and they don't have a next-gen player on par with Macklin Celebrini. That may very well be their undoing, but it's no short bet. Defensively, the Canadians have Cale Makar. Some recent uneven play aside, he's the best in the world. His American counterpart, viewed as a 1A in some circles, is Quinn Hughes. Fittingly, neither team has any real blue line weakness, and both will have a lineup filled with players who fill particular needs. Zach Werenski's high-end offensive ability make him something of an X factor for the American team. He was outstanding at the Four Nations tournament. Goaltending figured to be the U.S.'s biggest advantage, and that may well turn out to be the case. But Connor Hellebuyck, the starter and consensus best in the world at the position, is in the midst of a mediocre season with the Winnipeg Jets. That fact, combined with his recent postseason problems, should be noted. For Canada, Jordan Binnington has followed up his strong play at the Four Nations tournament with putridity for the St. Louis Blues. It's easy to imagine him flipping the switch, and it's easy to imagine him getting benched early in the tournament for Logan Thompson, who's been one of the best goalies in the league since joining the Washington Capitals out of the 2024/25 season, and who played his way onto the Olympic roster. Other medal favorites. Not long ago, injuries had Sweden's arrow pointing decidedly downward. Over the last week or so, Victor Hedman, their cornerstone defenseman, and William Nylander, their best forward, returned to their respective NHL lineups, as did a few other role players, although Nylander's status for the opener has come back into question. That should put Sweden back at the top of the bronze medal favorites. The blue line has Hedman, and in his Norris candidate, Rasmus Dahlin, bounce back likely Hall of Famer Erik Karlsson, and plenty other highly competent NHL players. One issue, though, is a lack of superstar talent in the forward group. Leo Carlsson, as the Anaheim Ducks, was on his way of providing this after a remarkable start to the season, but a nasty thigh injury forced him to withdraw. As a high-end first-line center, he could help Sweden push the North American teams down the line, but not this year. Sweden's goaltending situation also could be better. Ostensible number one Philip Gustafsson has put up an .894 save percentage and allowed more than 2 goals above expected since January 1st, while his teammate in Minnesota, Jesper Wallstedt, is just 23. Jacob Markstrom is in the midst of an ugly stretch for the New Jersey Devils. When Alexander Barkov tore his ACL and MCL in training camp, it let some of the air out of Finland's balloon. Barkov is a two-way superstar for the Florida Panthers, a game-changing force at the top of the lineup. The Panthers haven't adequately replaced him, and the Finns likely won't do so either. There's still elite talent at other positions in defenseman Miro Heiskanen and winger Mikko Rantanen. Sebastian Aho and Roope Hintz aren't Barkov, but they're high-end NHL players in their own right. Beyond that, the Finns have a knack for playing pesky, effective tournament hockey, which you'll hear about ad nauseum during the tournament, but there's a very large Barkham-shaped hole in the roster. The Czech Republic, also known as Czechia during international sports competitions, has also become something of a trendy upset pick. That's for good reason. Winger David Pastrnak is a group-dominating winger and one of the best players in the NHL, and the forward group is an interesting one overall. Goaltender Lukas Stofstall of the Anaheim Ducks is highly capable of stealing games, and after some uneven play, put up a .930 save percentage in his 9 pre-Milan games. The issue for Czechia, though, is a defensive group with just 2 NHL players. The rest of the field. Switzerland has a few high-end players in the mix in Nashville Predators defenseman Roman Josi, New Jersey Devils center Nico Hischier, and Los Angeles Kings winger Kevin Fiala. They've got a handful of other legit NHLers too, including a net. Akira Schmidt has been decent for the Vegas Golden Knights and has a spectacular silver medal run in the 2024 World Championships. Still, there's not enough depth to make them anything more than a snowball's chance bronze candidate. Slovakia has done well to rebound in the 12 years since their crash out in Sochi, with the roster built around Montreal Canadiens winger and 2022 number 1 overall Pek Yuri Slavkovsky, and a solid defensive group led by Eric Cernak, Martin Faravi, and Simon Nemec. They don't have an NHL goalie on the roster, though, and that seems like a fatal flaw. Germany is led by a former MVP, Leon Draisaitl, a 90-point center, Tim Stutz, a potential future Norris Trophy winner, Moritz Seider, and a 3-time 20-goal scorer, JJ Peterka. That alone makes them interesting. For the rest of the roster, though, remains a step beyond the medal containers. For Denmark, Nikolai Ehlers was one of the best wingers last season free agent class, and Frederik Andersen, when healthy, has been a solid starting NHL goaltender. They're joining plenty of holdovers from a roster that in 2025, for the first time, played in a bronze medal game at the Worlds. Latvia's best players are bottom 6 NHL forwards Zemgus Girgensons, Teddy Bluger, and backup goaltenders Arturs Silovos and Elvis Merzlikins. The country hasn't competed at the Olympics since 2014, when goaltender Kirstus Gulevskis pushed Canada to its limits with a 55-save quarterfinal loss. There are familiar names on France's roster. Alexander Texier scored 7 times in his first 30 games with the Canadiens this season, and Pierre-Edouard Bellemare played for 5 different NHL teams in 5 seasons, but overall, they're not in the happy-to-be-here group. France hadn't qualified for the Olympics since 2002. Italy, included due to its host nation status, could have tried to load up on NHL players with Italian heritage. Instead, each of the 25 players is at least a dual citizen, and all played a part in helping Italy earn a promotion to the top level of the IIHF World Hockey Championship in 2025. It's an interesting story, if nothing else. February 11th. The first day will give us our first look at Finland in a relatively tough matchup against Slovakia. In the late game, Sweden gets to ease into the tournament against Italy. It will also be the first chance at watching some men's action at Milano Santiago Ice Hockey Arena. But after some touch-and-go moments during the construction process, all signs point to the ice surface being a non-issue. The women's tournament began on the 5th without immediately obvious pressure points. On the 12th, the second day of games brings us to our list of 4 straight quadruple headers. We're getting our looks at Canada against Czechia, the United States against Latvia. Game 3 may be the most relevant of the day, as it is between Germany and Denmark. On the 13th, today's highlight undoubtedly is Sweden versus Finland. In Game 2, this could determine who wins Group B and an automatic turn to the quarterfinals. In Game 1, Italy plays Slovakia in what is likely to be the best shot at winning on home ice. On the 14th, Slovakia plays Sweden in Group B, and the United States will be heavily favored over Denmark in Group C. On the 15th, Czechia is in an early game against Switzerland, which could be an auto pass for the quarterfinals. Canada should be able to ease out of group play against France. Latvia versus Denmark may well have major seeding implications. And in the late game, the United States plays Germany, and that could be an interesting one, given the star player at the top of the German lineup. Men's hockey games will be available on national broadcasts across CBC, TSN, and Sportsnet in Canada, as well as CBC in the United States. NBC is the American Olympic broadcaster and will air games largely on USA Network and CNBC, with at least one quarterfinal and semifinal, along with the gold medal game on NBC. Games will also be streamed on Peacock and NBC Sports platform. The TV and streaming schedule can be seen here. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Services. Thousands of amateur gamblers are beating Wall Street PhDs. Economics have noticed that betting markets like Kalshi and Polymarket are pretty good at predicting not just political events, but economic data too. By Lydia D. Felice. Economists at top banks and investment firms who command high salaries to divine the direction of the economy expected the latest jobs report on Wednesday to show that about 68,000 jobs were added last month. A crowd of anonymous online gamblers placing bets on Kalshi, a prediction site, expected to see 54,000 new jobs. The report ended up showing that the U.S. economy had missed and had added 130,000 jobs at the start of the year. Both groups had missed the mark by a wide margin, and to similar degrees. Over the last 5 years that Kalshi has existed, its thousands of gamblers have proved as accurate on average as predicting certain economic indicators as the highly trained forecasters, a working paper published last month by the National Bureau of Economic Research found. The crowd is also pretty good at predicting interest rate decisions from the Federal Reserve, and even better than the professionals at predicting the rate of inflation. Getting information from a large pool of people can be a remarkably good form of forecasting, says Jonathan Wright, an economics professor at Johns Hopkins University, who co-wrote the paper. Thomas Simons, a U.S. economist with Jefferies, the investment firm, took notice when Kevin Warsh was leading in the prediction markets to be President Trump's nominee for the chair of the Federal Reserve. Mr. Simons has dismissed the possibility because Mr. Walsh's past advocacy for higher interest rates rather than the lower rates that Mr. Trump prefers. How could it possibly be that he's the head of this? It doesn't make any sense, Mr. Simons recalled thinking. But the markets turned out to be right, and he decided he shouldn't have disregarded the odds. Bettors, he realized, have one advantage. They don't have to make a prediction if they're not highly confident that they're right. Professional forecasters don't have a choice. Even if the data are confusing, they don't have much conviction in their number, they guess. You have to forecast these numbers every month, even when you don't necessarily think that you have some kind of edge, Mr. Simons says. So it started to make me feel like if I go back to my priors on this, the people who have the edge are the ones who are going to participate. Another working paper by economists at the London Business School and Yale University found that Polymarket bettors, as well as whole forecast corporate earnings, more accurately than the analysts who are paid to advertise and advise investors on whether to buy or sell. Theus Jensen, a Yale professor who worked on the paper, thinks the comparatively good performance by thousands of amateurs can be chalked up to incentives. Professional analysts may have conflicts of interest, such as their firm's trading commissions, which may make rise in response to rosier forecasts. Analysts may also avoid publishing earnings forecasts that are out of the norm, which can lead to more embarrassment than sticking with the crowd. The nice thing about prediction markets is that you have to put your money where your mouth is, Mr. Jensen said. And so that highly incentivizes you to state your true beliefs. Of course, that has been true for decades. The first online prediction markets emerged early in the 2000s. Sites like InTrade focused mostly on elections and the likelihood of other world events and were generally found to be fairly accurate. In the 2010s, U.S. regulators cracked down, ruling that they were operating as illegal online gambling platforms. But some platforms continue to operate in Europe, where political and economic contracts are a sideshow to enormous volumes of sports betting. The same is still true of Kalshi, which won a lawsuit allowing to operate legally in 2024, and Polymarket, which is only sporadically accessible in the United States, as lawsuits have blocked trading in many states. And yet, betting volume, even on non-sports questions, has explained and expanded at such a torrid pace that forecasters and analysts are taking on notice. On any given day, more than $60 million is at stake on the platforms on political and economic questions, far more than the earlier platforms reached. Edward Rigney runs Stand, a company that allows bettors to trade simultaneously on Kalshi and Polymarket and follow other large traders. He said many of his highest volume customers work in the same fields where they wagered. One user in Hong Kong buys and sells Nvidia stock in his day job and uses his tariff-related prediction markets contractions as a hedge. If the Trump tariffs continue to escalate towards China or something, he can get out of his position and not get blown away. He sees another piece of evidence that bettors specialize. Most of them aren't good at everything. You can see that a lot of traders who are really good at elections aren't very good at crypto, or if you're good at crypto, you're not good at geopolitics. Michael Ferrellini, U.S. economist at J.P. Morgan, has access to deep well of expertise from the bank's political affairs staff, country specialists, and equity researchers, but he still looks at the markets to get a more precise estimate. Whenever you talk to DC people, they'll say, well, I think that they'll get the budget done. So what's the probability? Mr. Farrelly said. It's a different language. Often you'll have to really push to get a quantitative answer. On the quantitative answers that are in his stock trade, like forecasting changes to the consumer price index and domestic product, Mr. Farrelly expects something else is going on. The betting markets are just following the experts. That could be monitoring the Bloomberg consensus, reading research from the big investment houses, or tracking the futures markets and investor expectations that groups like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange already aggregate. Tara Sinclair, an economist at George Washington University who studies forecasting, agrees that it is likely, and therein lies the danger of prediction markets. If the crowd were to supplant professional forecasters, individual bettors would lose out. They would be making the jobs of the contributions harder, because now they have individual sources of information to draw from. If they don't replace all of that, then they won't have those also to go to. Most forecasters aren't worried about that because they do more than predict numbers. Every estimate comes with a detailed analysis of the factors underneath the headline number, which is what investors and companies need to figure out how to spend money. Alright, continuing on. Quote, surprises happen and people want to know. What does this mean? What's going to happen? What's driving it? Said Michael Pugliese, a U.S. economist with Wells Fargo. I think that's a lot of nuanced, important information that you'd want to have when you are making decisions as an operator in these markets. But prediction markets could become an input for some complex forecasts, like those constructed by the Federal Reserve. Justin Wolfer is an economics professor at the University of Michigan who studied and wrote about the earlier iterations of prediction markets, has told Fed officials that they should take those markets into consideration. They have been hesitant, he said. There's a deep problem, which is, if you were to do this, you democratize decision making, Mr. Wolfer said. Right now, the senior economist has a ton of power. Their view goes. It may also be true that neither individual expects nor a collective of thousands are the best at predicting the future. Over the past decade, a group called Good Judgment has developed a model of depicting and selecting people with good track records of figuring out what will happen. These, quote, super forecasters are allowed to longer range questions of interest to paying clients. They work collaboratively, but ultimately cast their own votes. Warren Hatch, the organization's chief executive, thinks prediction markets complement his group's services because they focus on shorter term questions and expand the use of probabilistic thinking. Now he is watching the emergence of another predictive force, artificial intelligence, which can synthesize large amounts of standardized information to come up with reasonably good expectations and estimates. But AI can have a tough time with questions that more have to do with humans and culture and less to do with numbers and metrics. Quote, when the data is sparse and the environment is in flux, machines are backward looking by definition. And that's where I think the space for humans will remain. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Opinion piece, guest essay. OpenAI is making the mistakes Facebook made. I quit. This week, OpenAI started testing ads on ChatGPT. I also resigned from the company after spending 2 years as a researcher helping to shape how AI models were built and priced, and guiding early safety policies before standards were set in stone. I once believed I could help the people building AI get ahead of the problems it would create. This week confirmed my slow realization that OpenAI seems to have stopped asking the questions I joined to help answer. I don't believe the ads are immoral or unethical. AI is expensive to run, and ads can be a critical source of revenue. But I have a deep reservation about OpenAI's strategy. For several years, ChatGPT users have generated an archive of human candor that has no precedent, in part because people believed they were talking to something that had no ulterior agenda. Users are interacting with an adaptive, conversational voice in which they have revealed their most private thoughts. People tell chatbots about their medical fears, their relationship fears, their beliefs about God and the afterlife. Advertising built on the archive creates a potential of manipulating users in ways we don't have tools to understand, let alone prevent. Many people frame the problem of funding AI as choosing the lesser of two evils. Restrict access to transformative technology to a selective group of people wealthy enough to pay for it, or accept advertisements even if it means exploiting users' deepest fears and deepest desires to sell them a product. I believe that's a false choice. Tech companies can pursue options that could keep these tools broadly available while eliminating any company incentives to surveil, profile, and manipulate its users. OpenAI says it will adhere to principles for running ads on ChatGPT. The ads will be clearly labeled, appear at the bottom of the answers, and will not influence responses. I believe the first iteration of ads will probably follow these principles, but I'm worried about subsequent iterations won't, because the company is building an overriding economic agenda and economic engine that creates strong incentives to override its own rules. The New York Times has sued OpenAI for copyright infringement of news content related to AI systems. OpenAI has denied these claims. In its early years, Facebook promised that users would control their data and be able to vote on policy changes. Those comments and commitments eroded. The company eliminated holding public votes on policy. Privacy changes marketed as giving users more control over their own data were found by the Federal Trade Commission to have done the opposite, and in fact made private information public. All of this happened gradually under pressure from an advertising model that rewarded engagement above all else. The erosion of OpenAI's own principles to maximize engagement may already have been underway. It is against company principles to optimize user engagement solely to generate more advertising revenue. but it has been reported that the company already optimizes for daily active users anyway, likely by encouraging the model to be more flattening and syncopatic. This optimization can make users feel more dependent on AI for supporting in their lives. We've seen the consequences of dependence, including psychiatrists documenting instances of chatbot psychosis and allegations that chatbot and ChatGPT reinforced suicidal ideation in some users. Still, advertising revenue can help ensure that access to the most powerful AI tools doesn't default to those who can pay. Sure, Anthropic says that it'll never run ads on Claude, but Claude has a small fraction of ChatGPT's 800 million weekly users. Its revenue strategy is completely different. Moreover, top-tier subscriptions for ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude now cost $200 to $250 a month, more than 10 times the cost of a standard subscription to Netflix or a single piece of software. So the real question is not ads or no ads. It is whether we can design structures that can avoid both excluding people from using these tools and potentially manipulating them as consumers. I think that we can. One approach is explicit cross-subsidies, using profits from one service or customer base to offset losses from another. If a business pays AI to do high-value labor at a scale that was once the job of human employees, for example, a real estate platform using AI to write listings or valuation reports, it should also pay surcharges that subsidizes free or low-cost access for everyone else. This approach takes some inspiration from what we already do with essential infrastructure. The Federal Communications Commission requires telecom carriers to contribute to a fund to keep phone and broadcast affordable in rural areas and to low-income houses. Many states add a public benefits charge to electricity bills to provide low-income assistance. A second option is to accept advertising but pair it with real governance. Not a blog post of principles, not a binding structure with independent oversights how personal data is used. There are partial precedents for this. German codetermination law requires companies like Siemens or Volkswagen to give workers up to half the seats on supervisory boards, showing that former stakeholder representation can be mandatory inside private firms. Meta is bound to follow content moderation rulings issued by its oversight board, an independent body of outside experts, though its efficacy has been criticized. What the AI industry needs is a combination of these approaches, a board that includes both independent experts and representatives of the people whose data is at stake, with binding authority over what controversial data can be used for targeting advertisement, what counts as material policy change, and what users are told. The third approach involves putting users' data under independent control through a trust of cooperative with a legal duty to act in users' interests. For instance, MIDATA, a Swiss cooperative, lets members store their health data on an encrypted platform and decide case by case whether to share it with resources. MIDATA's members govern its new policies at a General Assembly and an ethics board that they elect reviews research requests for access. None of these two options are easy, but we have time to work them out and avoid the two outcomes I fear most: a technology that manipulates the people who use it at no cost, and one that exclusively benefits the few who can afford to use it. Thank you. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from February 11th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Brian. Thank you very much for listening.